The snow fell like broken glass onto SciFi, each flake sharp enough to cut through hope itself. In the endless white wasteland where 3 pale suns barely warmed a frozen ground, a man stood alone at the edge of everything he'd ever known. About loneliness. Darren hadn't heard his own voice in 17 days. The wind didn't count as conversation, it only screamed back at him, telling him secrets he didn't want to hear. He pulled his thick coat tighter and stared at the empty horizon, watching the weakest of the 3 suns sink toward the rocky ridge. Soon darkness would swallow this world for 40 straight hours. Not that it mattered anymore. Being alone had become easy. Like breathing poison air until your lungs forgot what clean oxygen felt like. The wind moved through the valley like a living thing, dragging chunks of ice across his transport ship with sounds like fingernails on metal. This planet had a voice, not just the usual howling that came from air hitting rock, but something deeper. Something that sounded like warnings spoken backward. In a language meant for the dead, Darren turned his back on the sound and pulled his hood down over his ears until the world became muffled and small. The weather beacon was almost finished. Power core locked in place, antenna spread out like metal spider legs. He'd spend tomorrow morning making final adjustments, assuming no storms hit or equipment failed. 3 more days and he'd be gone. That was always the deal. That was the rhythm of his life now. He liked jobs like this one, remote, technical, quiet. The kind of work nobody else wanted because it meant months of silence and frozen fingers. Out here in the middle of nowhere, nobody asked uncomfortable questions about weather station failures. Nobody mentioned the 20 people who had died under his last forecast. Nobody knew his name or the weight it used to carry before everything went wrong. The transport cabin felt like a metal coffin when he stepped inside, but at least it was warm. Darren set water to boil on the small heating unit and peeled off his thick gloves. His fingers looked raw and rough, marked by calluses that seemed cleaner than they deserved to be. He opened a meal pack, mashed root vegetables and protein flakes that tasted like cardboard. Dan ate standing up, watching snow pile higher against the small window. According to his files, this outpost had been abandoned for years. No recent activity logs, no power signals, nothing. The old satellite pictures showed a broken dome structure that had caved in on itself like a crushed egg. The last official record said it had been used as a weather station or maybe for research. The files were damaged, like they always were. This far from civilization, the important thing was that the place was empty. Darren had made absolutely sure of that before landing. His scans had shown no heat signatures, no movement, no radio signals. Just a half-buried structure with broken antennas, surrounded by ice, silence, and static interference. Until someone knocked on his door. The sound was so soft at first that he almost missed it. Just a dull tapping, barely louder than the wind. Tap, tap, pause, tap, 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 tap. Darren froze with food halfway to his mouth, listening hard. It came again, clearer this time. 5 quick raps against the airlock's outer shell, like someone trying to be polite about asking for help. He set down his food slowly, carefully, and moved to the control panel. His fingers flew over the buttons, bringing up the external camera. Feed. The screen flickered to life, showing him nothing but swirling snow and darkness. But then something moved at the edge of the frame, just a flicker of shadow near the door. Darren stepped toward the airlock, his boots silent on the metal floor. His hand hovered over the emergency seal switch, ready to lock everything down if needed. Another knock came, deliberate and patient, hitting the door at about chest height for an adult. He adjusted the camera angle and pointed it lower, then stared at the screen in disbelief. A child stood in the snow outside his ship. She was barefoot, wearing nothing but a thin thermal sheet that clung to her small shoulders like broken wings. Her skin was pale blue, the color of ice under morning light. Long black hair hung down her back, heavy with snow that had frozen into clumps. Her eyes were deep green, It's too wide and too still for someone so young. Darren felt his stomach drop in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. Nobody was supposed to be here. Nobody could survive out there dressed like that. He hesitated for only a second before hitting the override button. The hatch slid open with a hiss of warm air escaping into the frozen night. The girl didn't flinch. When the heat hit her, she just blinked slowly and looked up at him with those impossible green eyes. When she spoke, her voice was clear but hollow, like it had been waiting a long time to be used. "My mother needs a husband," she said simply. "She cries herself to sleep every night since Dad left." Darren stared down at her, his mind struggling to process what he was hearing. The girl's face didn't change, didn't show any embarrassment or uncertainty. She was completely serious, like she was discussing the weather. The wind curled around her legs, lifting the edge of her makeshift blanket. Her lips had turned gray-blue from the cold, and her small fingers clutched the fabric in tight fists. "I think she's breaking," the girl added, almost like an apology. That broke Darren out of his shock. He moved fast, pulling the girl inside and sealing the hatch behind them. The cabin's warmth hit her like a physical force, and for the first time, her calm expression cracked. Her small body shook violently as the heat soaked into her frozen skin. Darren grabbed a spare blanket from his supplies and wrapped it around her, then crouched down to her level. Her toes were blotched purple and black with frostbite. Her cheeks were raw and red from windburn. She should have been dead. "Where's your mother?" he asked, keeping his voice gentle and low. The girl blinked slowly, taking in the room around. Heartha, metal walls, the humming heater, the single chair bolted to the floor. Everything must have seemed strange and wonderful after whatever she'd been living in. "In the shelter," she said, pointing vaguely toward the northeast in the direction of the buried structure he'd scanned earlier. "Over there, she didn't want me to come, but I did anyway." "Why did you come?" Darren asked. The girl shifted, like she was trying to find the right words to explain something complicated. "You have warm boots," she said finally, looking down at his thick, insulated footwear, "and you didn't throw things at us like the others did?" Darren's eyebrows pulled together in a frown. "Others. They came after the big storms," she explained matter-of-factly. "Men in fancy suits. They yelled at Mom when she said no to them. Then they went away and didn't come back." Darren looked her over again, really seeing her this time. The sheet she wore had a frayed edge that looked like it had been cut from old parachute fabric. Her arms were too thin, like she hadn't been eating enough. Her lips still trembled from the cold, but she never cried. Not once. "What's your name?" he asked softly. "Volley," she said after thinking about it for a moment. "I'm 6 years old." Hit him harder than he'd expected. She looked older, maybe because of the serious way she held herself. The weight in her gaze that belonged to someone who'd seen too much. But when she said her age, she said it like a child trying to prove she was still allowed to be one. Darren stood up and moved to the heating controls, turning them up another degree. Then he opened his supply bin and pulled out a spare set of thermal leggings and thick socks. He helped her get dressed, and she didn't flinch at his touch, but she didn't lean into it either. She was used to taking care of herself when she was properly bundled up. He handed her a water pouch. She drank desperately, gulping until she choked, then coughed and laughed at the same time. It was just a breathy, startled sound, but it was the first truly childlike thing she'd done. Darren turned away to give her a moment of privacy. Outside, the wind howled even louder, like it was angry that she'd escaped its grip. "Oh, show me," he said quietly when she'd finished drinking. "Take me to your mother." Volley nodded without hesitation and took his gloved hand in her small one. They stepped out into the snow together, and the cold hit them instantly, sharp and metallic, like breathing knives. But Volley didn't complain. She just walked steadily beside him, her feet crunching in the snow, leading him toward a dome that was half buried in the side of the ridge. The shelter was real, though Darren wouldn't have recognized it as livable from a distance. It looked like wreckage, a rust-stained metal structure covered in patchwork tarps and pieces salvaged from who knows what. But someone had carved narrow pathways through the ice around it, reinforcing the frame with hollow beams and thick canvas ropes. It was a home built from desperation and determination at the door. Volley turned to look up at him. "She doesn't talk much anymore," she said. "Seriously. But she listens to everything. And she still sings sometimes in the morning when she thinks I'm sleeping." Darren nodded once, understanding more than she probably realized. The wind dropped for a second, as if the planet itself was holding its breath. Volley pushed open the door. A tall woman stood just beyond the threshold, and Darren's breath caught in his throat. She had the same luminous blue skin as her daughter, but darker like deep ocean water under moonlight. Her black hair was pulled back in thick braids that had come loose from sleep or exhaustion. She was barefoot, wrapped in layers of repurposed thermal gear that hung on her thin frame. Her shoulders were straight, her eyes shadowed and unreadable. But her gaze locked onto Darren instantly, with a mixture of cold wariness and fierce protectiveness. "My daughter shouldn't have disturbed you," she said in a low, controlled voice that carried years of practiced dignity. "I don't think she had a choice," Darren replied honestly. The woman's posture tightened, every muscle ready for conflict, but she didn't close the door. Instead, she looked down at Volley, really, looked at her hands, some of the steel in her shoulders. Softened. "She's warm," she whispered, like it wasn't supposed to be possible. Like warmth was a miracle she'd stopped believing in. Darren said nothing. He waited, letting her make the decision. After a long moment, the woman stepped aside, creating space for him to enter. And just like that, Darren Mirren walked into a place he hadn't expected to find, a home still standing against impossible odds, with voices still singing, and a girl who believed he could fix what was breaking. Even if he didn't believe it himself yet, the door closed behind him with a muted hiss, sealing out the wind and the pale, gnawing cold that clung to his coat like old regrets. The air inside the shelter was dry and stale, mixed with metallic smoke and something older, like memories that had been sealed too long in a forgotten room. It wasn't truly warm, not really, just less brutally cold. It's the kind of temperature that slowed your shivering without stopping it completely. A small heating unit hummed from the center of the room, flickering with dull orange light under layers of soot and makeshift shielding. Everything here was built from salvaged parts, support struts from old landing gear, tarps stitched together from pressure tent fabric, wiring that looked like it had been pulled from a dozen different machines. Nothing matched, but somehow it all held together. Volley padded ahead of him, her small feet silent on the uneven floor. She moved like someone who had learned to be invisible. Neither hurried nor afraid, just practiced in the art of not drawing attention. She curled up near the heater, wrapped in the spare blanket Darren had given her, her face already turning toward sleep. Narrated, he assumed that was the woman's name. Though she hadn't offered it, hadn't said a word since letting him inside. She stood near the far wall, with her arms crossed and her shoulders taut with tension. Her black hair, twisted into thick braids, was half undone, like she hadn't had the time or energy to care about appearances. Her eyes stayed fixed on him, calm but watchful, like prey deciding whether the predator was too tired to attack. "I didn't mean to intrude," Darren said, his voice low and steady. "She found me." Nari didn't blink. "She knows better than to wander. Off she came anyway because she's 6 years old and thinks she can fix everything." The words snapped out too fast, too sharp, and she immediately went still, like she was angry at herself for the outburst. She looked toward Volley, her expression softening, then turned back to Darren. "And I was careless. That won't happen again." Darren raised his hand slightly, a gesture meant to show he wasn't a threat. "She's braver than most adults I've met. You didn't raise her wrong." Neri's lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't answer, but something in her eyes shifted slightly. Darren adjusted the strap of his pack. feeling its weight on his spine. "My name's Darren. I'm here to install a weather beacon. 2 days, maybe 3, and then I'm gone." "Then you shouldn't waste your time here," she said flatly. "You don't owe us anything." "No," he agreed. "But I don't make a habit of leaving people to freeze in the dark either." A flicker of something crossed her expression, not surprise, but something wearier, like she'd heard similar promises before, too many times, and none of those people had stayed. "I don't need your pity," she said. "This isn't pity," she raised an eyebrow. "Then what is it?" He hesitated. His real answer was too big to name, too old and complicated. He settled on something simpler, a temporary kindness. "That's how it always starts," she murmured, more to herself than to him. The silence that settled between them felt fragile, like thin ice over deep water. Darren stepped forward and crouched beside the heating unit. He didn't touch it, just observed. The control panel had been jury-rigged with spare parts, wires braided together with frayed copper strands. Power was bleeding off in irregular intervals, and the whole system looked like it was held together by hope and desperation. "This is dying," he said quietly. "It works," Nari replied, "for now, but your bleeding heat, the power draw is unstable. It'll burn out." Her arm stayed crossed. "I've made it last through 3 cycles, and the next, no," answered Naren. Stood and opened one of the side compartments. Of his pack, he pulled out a coiled power filament standard issue spare. He laid it gently on the table for the core, he said. "I have more on the ship." Her gaze flicked to the coil, then to him. "I don't take gifts good. It's not a gift, it's practical. You need heat. I need you alive so your daughter doesn't freeze chasing another stranger." The edge in his voice surprised even him. Niari stepped closer, not aggressively, more like she needed to see him clearly up close without the filter of cold and distance. Her expression shifted just slightly. Asif, something in his face made sense. Now she picked up the filament, tested its weight. "Why do you care if we freeze it?" Aaron didn't look at her. "Because once I didn't, and people died a beat past he hadn't meant to say that," but he didn't take it back. Nari turned the coil in her hands, then nodded toward the wall unit, the exchangers, their powers routed through the secondary grid. "It shorts. If you push it too fast, then we won't push." They worked in silence. For a time, Darren sat down his pack and started pulling tools. Nari unlatched the maintenance panel, revealing a scorched converter blackened with carbon buildup. She knelt beside him. The glow of the heater painting amber lines along her jaw and cheekbones, her skin that deep cobalt blue, shimmered faintly in the light, like something live beneath the surface. She didn't speak, but her hands were steady, familiar with tools, not formula-trained. Her technique was improvised, but capable. She handed him a thermal clamp without being asked. "Cut the filaments when." He needed space. She was good and careful, but never relaxed. At one point their fingers brushed. She froze just for a breath. Darren didn't move. He didn't look at her, but he left his hand where it was. Then slowly she continued. The work behind them. Veli had fallen asleep. Her breathing was quiet, shallow. The blanket had slipped from one shoulder, and Darren saw the faint outline of her spine, too visible, too thin. "She doesn't cry," Nari said suddenly. Her voice was soft, now measured, like each word cost her. "Not anymore. Not since she saw what crying gets you." Darren stayed silent. "I used to sing to her," she said. "Before, why did you stop?" Nari's lips tightened. "Because singing only matters if someone's listening, and no one was." He looked over at her then, but her gaze was far away, fixed on the cracked metal wall. "She told me you used to have a mate. I had a partner. He died when the clan's ship left orbit. We were late. The snow came early. They didn't wait." She said others came. They didn't stay. Why? Nari didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was flat. "Because I wouldn't pair with them. They called it a placement. As if I were livestock. They said the child needed stability, and they left." They tried to take her. Her hands clenched on the edge of the panel. "I made sure they didn't." Darren's jaw tightened. He didn't know what to say. He'd been trained to fix circuits, not broken things in people, but something in Her posture made him want to sit closer anyway. "I'm sorry," he said at last. "Don't be Nari," whispered. "You didn't cause it. I meant, I'm sorry no one stayed." Her head tilted slightly. She didn't speak, but her eyes for the first time didn't look like they were waiting for him to leave the exchanger. Click it softly, the first sign of stable power. Flow the room filled with a low hum, gentle but steady. Heat rose slow and even, not enough to sweat, but enough to breathe. Darren stood, wiped his hands on a cloth, and moved back to where slept, had adjusted the blanket over her shoulders. She stirred, murmured something half-formed, and settled again. Neri watched him carefully. "I'll sleep here," Darren said, gesturing to a patch off-floor near the door. "Just for the night. In the morning, I'll bring the backup coil, finish the beacon, then I'll be gone." Nari gave no reaction, just moved to the other side of the room and sat beside the core, arms around her, knees facing the quiet. "You say that like it's a promise," she said softly. "It is." She nodded. "Barely good." But neither of them slept right away. The heat spread slow through the walls, driving out the edge of the cold. And for the first time in a long time, Darren didn't feel like was in exile. He felt like he'd walked into the middle of something, still holding on, still fighting a broken shelter, a silent mother, and a child who believed in strangers. He closed his eyes back against the metal wall and listened to the quiet. It no longer sounded like failure, it sounded like the beginning of something else. Darren woke to the faint hiss of heat passing through the shelter's core panel. A sound so soft it might have been imagined. It was warm, not comfortable, but no longer deadly. Frost on. The walls had thinned overnight into beads of meltwater running slowly in crooked veins toward the floor. His shoulders cracked as he pushed upright from where he'd slept, blanket draped over him, back still sore from the uneven metal plating beneath. Across the room, Niari was already awake. She always was. She sat on her heels near the core, legs folded beneath her spine, impossibly straight. Her eyes were half-lidded, her hands resting on her knees like a figure carved from calm, yet she watched. Everything, Darren's movement, the shift in air temperature, even the faint sputter of the burner. Like someone who trained herself not to miss the next sign of collapse. On the far side of the room, behind a curtain of thermocloth vellies, stirred a small grunt followed by the rustle of blankets and a soft exhale. She didn't wake fully, just shifted content to stay buried a little longer. Darren stretched his arms overhead and stood, running a hand over his unshaven jaw. She slept through the night. Nari gave a single nod. She must have needed it. Nari's gaze drifted to the curtain, then back. It's been a long time since Sesh let herself. Darren didn't press. He crossed to his pack and pulled out a ration bar, then hesitated. He broke it in half and brought one piece to Niari. She didn't reach for it right away. When she did, her fingers brushed his. "Not quite a deliberate, but not completely accidental. Thank you," she said quietly. They 18 silenced the shelter, held its warmth, the hum of the core steady, now dependable. Outside, the storm had eased. No more howling against the metal, just the occasional low gust, like the planet was catching its breath. "I'll need to finish the beacon today," Darren said, wrapping the last of the bar. "The signal's only partial, without the upper transducer, and if another storm comes through without warning, we'll be blind again." Nuri finished. Her voice was not auditory, just factual. He nodded. "It won't take long, a few hours. You're leaving after that?" Darren looked at her. Her tone wasn't sharp, but it wasn't casual either. He shrugged. That was Thejib. She turned her gaze back to the heater. "You should do your job." He didn't answer. He stepped outside just after midday. The light was weak but visible, the cloud cover thinning in patches overhead. The storm had stripped the land bare in places, scattering frost-crusted rock and debris across the flats. His boots crunched through the icy crust with each step. At the top of the ridge, the beacon tower stood like a relic, half swallowed by snow. He set to work without delay, hands moving in quiet rhythm, unscrewing the shield casing, replacing the filament coils, aligning the transducer's reach toward orbit. It wasn't complicated work, not for him, but his mind kept drifting to his words, her clarity, her unnatural calm. "Mom needs a husband. She cries when she thinks I'm asleep." Darren had seen war collapse, terraforming failures, flash floods, and station implosions, but something about The plain sadness in that child's voice unsettled him more deeply than any of eyes. Finished the calibrations, checked the uplink twice, and stood staring at the blinking green light. The signal was stable, his job was done. Still, he didn't move by. The time he returned to Theshelter Valley was outside, sitting cross-legged in the snow, carving symbols into the ice with a metal stick. Hep paused at the top of the rise, watching her. She was small in a way that made the world look even more enormous. Then a towel ready was her coat was too. Big sleeves swallowing her hands, but her focus didn't waver. Each stroke she made had meaning. He walked down slowly, boots crunching softly. "What are you drawing?" he asked. She looked up, smiled shyly. "Cloud maps." "Yeah," he crouched beside her. "That's a good one. You see how the wind curled the edge like a hook?" Her eyes widened. "You know, wind shapes. I've worked with them for a long time." She leaned in, lowering her voice like sharing a secret. "Mama says the wind speaks, but only if you're quiet." He smiled a little, stunned. "She's right?" Looked at him, studying his face with the kind of intensity only children possessed. "Are you leaving?" He hesitated. "Should I?" She shrugged. "Everyone leaves. Do you want me?" She looked down, drew a slow spiral in the snow. "I think Mama doesn't cry. When you're here, that hit harder than it should have." He glanced toward the shelter where Nari stood at the entrance, arms folded, watching them. She didn't wave, but she didn't turn away. Either later, as they sat around the low-heat Corvelli, curled beside her mother, head resting on Nairi's thighs, fluttering on half-leap. Darren placed a fresh coil beside the burner and adjusted the intake valve. "I reinforced the beacon sublink. It's fully operational now. Next transmission cycle, someone will hear it." Nari looked at him, and then he met her gaze. "I should go," he said. "But I don't want to." She didn't react. He continued, "I've spent so long running from what I couldn't fix, from the people I let down. This place, it didn't ask anything of Moontal." His eyes flicked too. "I thought I came to install a machine, but I think I came to remember what it feels like to matter." Yari's face was unreadable. "Do you? We don't know yet," he admitted. "But I want to." She brushed a hand down her daughter's back, a slow, comforting motion. "Vi likes you. I like her too." Nari looked at him and me. It wasn't a flirtatious question. It was raw, honest. "I do," he said, "but I won't ask for anything you're not ready to give." She nodded, then quietly, "Would you stay if I asked?" His throat tightened. "Yes." She reached across the narrow space, took his hand in hers. Her talk was warm, firm, deliberate. She used to sing, murmured in her sleep. "Mama, you said to sing all the time." Darren looked at Nari. She met his eyes, then softly, like it hadn't been lost at all. Nari began to hum the melody. Wasn't a lullaby. It was older than that. Something built from starlight and silence, from wind and grief and survival. The kind of song you didn't learn, you remember. Darren closed his eyes. The storm was gone. But something else had settled, something like peace. The days that followed the storm passed not in a rush, but in a gentle, deliberate quiet, the kind of quiet that settles in the bones, the kind that means survival is no longer Theonly Gold to sorry. 4 had begun to thaw, though only in small places, pockets, where wind no longer sliced and the snow softened into meltwater. Along the slope behind the shelter, the ice had crocked enough for thin blades of violet moss to emerge, curling toward the weak sun. It was the first living color Darren had seen in weeks. He stood just outside the entrance, adjusting the placement of a solar array he'd modified from the old beacon parts. The new angle would catch more light during the elongated twilight and give them enough power to extend heat into the sleeping hours. It wasn't elegant, but it was effective. Inside, Theshelter pulsed with low, steady warmth. The temperature was stable now, barely, thanks to the backup coils and Yari's stubborn maintenance. There were no more emergency nights, no more crack seals or failing wires, just long days filled with repairs, food ration calculations, and something Darren hadn't dared think about in years. Routine. He returned to the doorway and paused. A charm. Valley hod tide still hung above the entrance, a small piece of carved bone strung on a thread of braided wire. It had started to darken with wind exposure, spinning slowly with each shift in the breeze. As he stepped inside, ran past him, her arms outstretched like wings trailing a strip of plastifoil behind. I'm a wind glider," she shouted, laughing, "and I bring good weather." Darren ducked, smiling as she spun in wild, lopsided circles. Nari sat nearby, knees pulled close, braiding another length of cord. She didn't stop her work, but looked up at him with something that days. A gal would have been too soft for her to allow. She's been naming the moss patches. She said I heard one's called King Frosty. Nari shook her head, amused, and one is named Fire Sneeze I'll try no, to take it personally. He moved to sit beside her, both of them, watching dance in the filtered sunlight coming through the thin insulation panel overhead. Does it ever feel strange? He asked quietly what this piece. She was quiet a long moment. Then yes, like a coat that's not mine, but I want it to fit. Darren glanced at her, studying her face and profile. It fits. Her eyes met. He's a stranger who became familiar. I never imagined that would feel safe. He exhaled slow. You never felt safe with your mate. I felt protected but not seen. He didn't speak. She set the braid aside and stood brushing dust from her hands. Come with me. Darren rose and followed her through the back panel of the shelter, where a storage tarp had been rolled aside to reveal a shallow ridge behind the structure. Beyond it, a wide span of snowfield extended into the valley. The sky had opened. Pale light bleeding across the horizon, Vel's footprints covered the path. Nari led him toward a cluster of stone piles arranged in a circle. This is where we were supposed to meet the migration fleet, she said softly. He was too sick. We stayed behind. I thought we'd find them. Again she crouched beside the central stone, flat and broad, and touched its surface gently. I buried part of him here. Shimmer mirrored his coat, his tools, the things they would have asked for proof. Darren knelt beside her. He didn't speak. The cold wind tugged at his jacket, but he didn't move. Niari looked down, her voice barely above the wind. After he passed, I stopped singing. I stopped believing Thorold would answer if I did. He turned to her, but it's answering now. She looked at him, eyes sharp with memory and grief, but no longer hollow, because you listened first. There was a pause. The wind shifted day, then 5. Then, without looking away from the stones, she reached for his hand. He took it without hesitation. That night, Vice sat on the floor beside Darren, showing him the symbols she'd scratched into a piece of salvaged metal with a heated blade. This one is warmth, she said, pointing, and this one is safe sleep. He smiled. And this? She grinned. That's us, our home. He looked at the crude symbol, 3 shapes, one tall, one medium, and one small, a shelter drawn in a triangle above them. You made this? Nodded. It's for the wall. He glanced at Nari, who stood nearby, watching from the edge of the room. She's been making a language. Nari said I didn't teach her all of it. Some came from her. She's brilliant. Darren said she's healing. Yari corrected softly. We both are. Later, after falling asleep, curled Best side the heater, Yari joined Darren at the table. She sat across from him, her eyes unreadable in the low light. You vested. She said I have, even though your work is done. He nodded. Why hadn't answer immediately? When he did, his voice was low and steady. Because I found something I never knew I needed. I came here to run from the past, but now I don't want to run anymore. Nari looked at them a long time, then quietly, neither do I. Silence stretched between them, comfortable now known. She stood, stepped around the table, and rested a hand on his shoulder. You don't have to say anything yet, she whispered, but tomorrow when the sun comes again, I want to show you where I'd plant a garden. He looked up at her, a flicker of something tender in his expression. I'll help you plant it, he said. Her hand lingered, then fell away as she turned. Tosley, beside her daughter Darren, sat alone a moment longer, listening to the steady rhythm of the heat, the soft breathing of a child, and the faint whistle of wind through a charm that now sounded less like a warning and more like an invitation. Something was growing here, not just moss, but trust roots and the promise of spring. Nari studied him, her face unreadable. Then she leaned forward, placed her hand over his. I don't want to go either. Something quiet and bright bloomed between them that evening while traced wind patterns into a chalked grid on the wall. Darren cooked a warm meal using the last of the root grains and Filter red broth, it wasn't fancy, but the air smelled rich and real, and the sound off bubbling liquid was more comforting than anything he'd heard in months. After dinner, Nari joined him at the doorway. They stepped outside together, coats wrapped tight shoulders, brushing. Above the stars had emerged sharp diamond cutiganes. The black eye used to wonder if the sky looked the same everywhere, Darren said. Nari tilted her head back. It doesn't, but this one feels clean. He looked at her. That's how it feels. Being with you. She turned toward him slowly. I'm not always easy. I don't offer soft words. I've spent so long surviving that I don't know how to be delicate. I don't need delicate, he said. I need true. She stepped closer. And what do you offer, Darren? He didn't look away. Everything I have. She was quiet a moment longer, then softly, then take this. She reached into her coat pocket and withdrew a small piece of wire twisted into a loose ring. It wasn't polished or symmetrical, but it was shaped with care and smoothed, looped. Just enough to hold it circled. Darren took it in his hand, thumb brushing over the metal. This is a bond, she said. Where I'm from, it doesn't have to be gold or stone. It just has to be chosen. He looked up at her. Then I choose Sade. She stepped into his arms. And for the first time they stood together, not as strangers or survivors, but as partners. The wind around them was light lifting. Charms that hung near the shelter's edge, the threads danced softly and sidely, peeked through the curtain, then grinned, and tiptoed to her sleeping role, drawing shapes in the air above her. Head before crawling in, she whispered, "They're family now." And the shelter, once a place of exile, now pulsed with warmth, with music, with something more permanent than walls and wires. It pulsed with home. The season had no name, nother. It wasn't spring, not in the way Earth had defined it. There were no blossoms, no bird song, no greening fields, but the world had changed. The snow no longer bit its skin, the wind still came, but it no longer screamed. Water ran freely now, in thin veins across the land, cutting small trails through the ice, as though Tasari for itself were stretching after a long frozen sleep. They had built a second shelter. It wasn't much, just an extension of the original dome, bolted onto the curve of the primary structure with repurposed plating, old beacon frame, and insulation. Stitched together from emergency blankets and scavenged tarp. It wasn't pretty, but it was warm inside. The walls hummed with stable heat. One room was for sleeping, one was for storing what little food they could preserve. And now, for the first time, they had a space just for a living. Darren knelt by the storage crates, stacking tools in organized rows. They'd built shelves out of salvaged antenna struts, and he was slowly filling them with everything that once lived in bags or corners. Nari stood across from him, watching with arms folded, a small smile tugging at the edge of her mouth. "You, sir, tools the way sorts her moss. She learned from the best," he said, straightening a spanner. Nari stepped closer, taking a coil of wire from his hand and setting it gently on the shelf. "She calls this place our station. Now he glanced up, not just the shelter anymore. She says, shelters are where you hide, Nari. Replied, stations are where you launch from." He laughed softly under his breath. "Sounds like she's planning something. She's always planning something," as if summoned, burst through curtain. Flap cheeks, flushed hair, tangled from wind. The glider came back. Both adults turned. "What glider?" Darren asked. "The one I saw last week, remember? Red wings. I saw it again down by the ridge." She gestured wildly, nearly tripping on her boots. Nari receded a brow. "Did it land?" "No," Veli said, clearly disappointed, "but it circled. That means it saw something interesting." Darren crouched beside her. "And what do you think it saw?" Vela lined in, grinning us. She dashed off again, this time to the small growing patch they'd claimed outside the structure, where thawed soil had been coaxed into stubborn rows of moss, grain, and frost roots. She knelt with the gravity the queen, inspecting her crops, whispering to the plants as though they'd whisper back. Nari watched her from the doorway, silent for a while. Then she spoke, voice low. "Do you ever think about what you would have done if we hadn't opened that door?" Darren didn't need to ask which door she meant. "That tearlock, that moment, that knock every day," he said. She glanced sideways. And an ick, no, I wouldn't be here, wouldn't be whole." He stepped beside her. What about you? I would have stayed silent, she said. Would have kept surviving for her, but not for myself. She looked up at him, then she saved us both. Darren nodded. That shedded. They stood there together as Vi danced between stone markers, singing a mad-up song about wind gliders and cloud butter rice and something called the Great. Like in war, she was loud, unfiltered Newfade. That night, the three of them sat by, the heater sketching spirals on her foil pad, Nari untangling the last off their salvaged cable, and Ziza, and Darren adjusting the solar relay schematic on the display screen at one point. Vi sat down her drawing, crawled across the floor, and climbed into Darren's lap. She settled there without a word, cheek pressed to his shoulder. He looked at Nari, surprised Nari didn't say anything, but her eyes held an answer, murmured something sleepily. What was that? Darren asked gently. I said, mumbled, eyes barely open, you feel like a dad. He froze for a second, then placed a hand over hers. I feel like one too. Later, after she'd fallen asleep and been tucked beneath her blankets, Naray and Darren stepped outside. The stars had come out, in full force, cutting sharp paths across the black sky. Tessera's moons were low and wide tonight, bathing the valley in cool silver light. They stood near the beacon tower. Nori purposed to track atmospheric balance for their microclimate. Its blinking light cast a rhythm across the snow like a heartbeat. Darren reached into his coat and pulled out a small object, a thin strand of braided copper looped into a circle, edges wrapped in a soft strip of Neris's woven fiber. She stared at it. He made something. He said, I see. I thought maybe we could make something official. She took the loop from his hand. It was crude, lopsided, but strong will you have? Me, he asked. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stepped forward, reached up and pressed her forehead to his. It was not just affection, it was a bond, as a cared gesture of her people. I already do, she whispered. He closed high sighs, holding that moment with both hands. When they pulled apart, she looped the band around her wrist, tight enough, toast enough to breathe. It doesn't need to be ceremony, she said. This place is our witness. He nodded. Then let's build a life the way we built the shelter, layer by layer. Nothing borrowed. Nothing borrowed, nothing forced, and no exits, she added. He smiled. Not unless you ask me to, shadn't. Weeks later, a storm returned. Not as brutal as before, but strong enough to send snow sideways, fast enough to rattle doors. They stayed inside, gathered close, listening to the familiar hum off's core. The charm above the door spun slowly, casting dancing shadows on thralls. Veli sat with her feet tucked under a woven blanket, turning a piece of old wiring into a new bracelet. Will Wilways live here? She asked. Darren met Nara's eyes before answering. Only if we choose to, every day. Thought for a moment. I think I'll stay forever, unless the glider comes to take me on an adventure. Ari laughed. Then it better be a good one. Belly grinned. I'll take you both with me, obviously. They smiled at her, at the warmth, the boldness, the hope. Later, as Duran and Yari lay side by side, their fingers laced loosely beneath the blankets, Darren whispered into the dark, can I tell you something? You can tell me anything. I've spent most of my life feeling like I didn't deserve peace, that it was for other people, but here with you, this life, we didn't just survive. Nari tightened her grip on his hand. We became the wind outside, howled once. Boutet didn't feel cruel. It felt like a lullaby in the morning. The light came through thin frost on the windows. Velia panned the door and hung a new charm, a triple loop braid with a carved stone heart at the center. What's that one for? Darren asked, rubbing his eyes, smiled, sleepy and proud. It keeps Thefamoli from drifting. Darren looked at Neri. She nodded, and the wind moved on past them, around them, but never through them again. The sun hung low in the sky, golden and wide, casting long shadows across. The softening snow. Tari 4 still held its chill, but it was no longer the kind that bit or warned. It was crisp, no sharp in the lungs, but kind to the skin, the kind of cold that made cheeks pink, not numb. Darren sat on the slope, just beyond the shelter's sleeves rolled up to his elbows, a small knife in hand. He was carving notches into a stick, marking the days since the last storm, not out of habit anymore, but memory. Beside him, Narrated was gathering small stones into a circle, laying them gently onto the thawing earth. It's going to be her stage, she said without looking up. Darren blinked. Her performance space, Nara's voice, carried a dry, knowing smile. She's been rehearsing all morning as if on key, bounded over the ridge barefoot, of course, 'cause no amount of gentle warning could keep her from claiming Thirth with her feet. Her long black hair flew wild behind her stir with bits of mows and bark. She wore a crown made of bent twigs and spark thread, the kind Darren had once used to seal cables, ladies and gentlemen. She cried, standing on the tallest stone in her makeshift circle today. I present to Youth Glider Queen, and the tail of the sky river Nari sat back on her heels, eyes alight. Oh, this is a new one. It has music this time, Veli said seriously, and acting and dancing. Can I clap now? Darren asked, or should I wait for the end? Vela pointed at him. Wait, you'll know when. Then she began. The story was part memory, part invention, of course. It involved a glider ship made of song, a river that flowed through clouds, and a princess played by herself who rescued an entire valley of frozen trees by singing the sun awake. There were battle cries, a few leaps that nearly toppled her from her stones, and a musical number that was mostly stomping and humming. She took breaks to catch her breath, then picked up right where she left off. Darren watched, chin resting on his hand, grinning the entire time. Neri's laughter came easily, softly, like it lived. There and no, when the show ended, Veli bowed deeply, arms wide. Thank you. Think you'll be here forever. 5 stars. Darren called. I laughed. I cried. A triumph. Nari clapped with both hands over her heart. Encore. Ellie skipped over and plopped down beside them in the grass. I'm tired, she said, but her smile betrayed her delight. Darren handed her a water flask. Real actors hydrate, she drank with a dramatic sigh, then leaned against his arm. You think the real glider will come back? She asked. I think it might, Darren said, but I also think the next great thing might already be here. Looked up at him, squinting. You're being poetic. Again he ruffled her hair. Guilty. They stayed like that for a while. Veli nestled between them, Nari's fingers weaving tiny braids into her daughter's hair. Darren watching clouds drift above like slow-moving ships. The wind curled around them in gentle spirals, lifting strands off hair, tugging at Ellie's crown, spinning the little charm she'd tied to the doorway. It was the kind of afternoon you don't notice until it's almost over, the kind that slips by like a breath, quiet hole. At one point fell asleep against Darren's side, her head warm against his ribs. Her fingers still clutching the twig crown in her lap, Nara reached across and touched Darren's knee. She never did that with him. She said, not coldly, not with pain, just honestly, she trusts you. Darren looked down at the little girl curled against him. His voice, when he answered, was thick. It trust her, too. And in the slow light of that sorry afternoon, as the sun dipped low behind ridgeline and the frost turned to a shimmer, they sat together, father, mother, daughter, not dreaming of escape or counting the days since last disaster, but simply being together. Alive, loved home. The night had been long, but not harsh. A soft wind moved outside the shelter, brushing over the new moss fields and the garden rows they'd coaxed from stubborn soil. Inside, the air was warm, and still the only light came from the coals in the heat core, casting a slow pulse across the walls. Painting soft gold on the curve of Nari's cheek, Darren lay beside her, one arm tucked under his head, the other curled around her back, her body pressed gently into his. All angles eased by trust, by time, by the 1,000 quiet acts of choosing each other. Every day she was quiet today, Yari, murmured her voice barely above a breath. Darren shifted slightly, not to move away, but closer, belly. She nodded, cheek brushing his collarbone. She's happy, I think, but quiet in a way I haven't seen. He let his fingers trace the length of her spine under the fabric of her woven tunic. She's growing, starting to notice. Her world doesn't stretch as far as her imagination, Nari sighed. She told me she wishes there was someone to play with in the evenings when we're working. Darren paused. Did she say that to you directly? She asked if she was made lonely on purpose. The answer left a quiet weight in the air. He exhaled slowly. She's never said that to me. Nari said, you're her hero. She doesn't want to make you sad. The silence between them softened, filled with unsaid things. I used to think we were just trying to survive. Darren said, but now we're building something. This place is ours, and she's part of it, but maybe? He hesitated, his thumb gently brushing the side of her ribs. Maybe it should grow, Nari finished for him. They lay in the quiet a while longer. Nari rolled slightly enough. Tom met his gaze in the firelight. Her eyes were clear, unafraid. There was no tension in her body, now no armor. I never thought I'd have another child, she said. I buried too much hope when I buried his coat. Darren reached up and tucked a strand of black hair behind her ear. And now I believe in things again. Her voice cracked slightly. Because of you. 'Cause you didn't come to save me. You came and stayed. He cupped her cheek, his thumb resting beneath her. I didn't stay for duty. I stayed by Kosua. Are my home. Nur leaned into the touch. Then let's build more of it. Her kiss was soft, but certain, the kind that asked no questions and needed no answer. Darren returned it with care, with reverence, with the slow, aching patience of someone who knew the cost of rushing, of breaking delicate things. Their bodies moved together with quiet understanding, no urgency, no need to prove, just their rhythm of breath. The giving and receiving of warmth, the shared choosing of a future. She held him as if anchoring hers to the earth, and he held her as if the ground had finally steadied beneath his feet. Later, they lay tangled in the blankets, the fire casting a flicker across the ceiling, their hands still intertwined. Anira's voice came again, barely above a whisper. Do you think it's selfish to want more in a world like this? Darren kissed Herknackle's number. I think it's the bravest thing we could do. She smiled. Then I'm not afraid. Neither was he. Outside, the wind carried the soft clinking of the charm above the door, still spinning after all this time. Notice? A warning anymore, but as a blessing inside in the warmth they had. Matatoger. They dreamed not of escape or rescue, but of laughter, of small footsteps, of a second voice. Joining the song that had once been silenced by grief, they dreamed of more. They dreamed of family.